My name is Greg Nichols. I'm the Science and Technology Advisor for the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center. My job is to tie all these presentations together, kind of give you an overview of technology, how it affects worker health and safety. Hopefully I'll be able to do that. So before I get started here, I want to read you something which I think is very interesting. So this is an article that was written by the International Labor Organization in regards to a panel that they put together talking about technology in the workplace. So one of the conclusions that they drew from this panel was that they all agree that new technology can reduce some safety and health hazards by relieving workers of arduous or dangerous physical tasks and removing them from exposure to dust and toxic substances. I think some of the things that we've seen today, kind of illustrates that we know that is true. What's interesting is that the same panel also concluded that there were some concerns about the potential new hazards that technology could create. With technology being developed, introduced, and transferred at an accelerating pace, governments, workers, and employers are faced with a variety of new serious safety and health hazards about which all too often little is known. So I think what this really demonstrates is the dual nature of technology, right? That it can be used to great benefit, but also there are things that we don't completely understand, and sometimes there could be a detriment. What I think is very ironic is that this article was written in 1985. So it's been over 30 years, but I think a lot of the same things still ring true today. So first thing I want to talk about, just kind of look at a historical picture. We know that when technology is implemented properly, it can have a huge impact, right, on worker health and safety. So one of the most dangerous industries I think that we can all agree is mining. And so this graph illustrates the number of fatalities associated with mine explosions from 1900 to 1990. You can see over time that there's a trend downward. We have a number of fatalities that have been reduced. I think what's interesting is you can see all these different kind of points where technology has been introduced, and almost immediately following that, we've seen a reduction in fatalities. Now, this is just very specific to mine explosions, but I think a lot of industries will have similar trends. So we know that when used correctly, when we understand it, when we have the right procedures in place, technology can be a great benefit. Part of the problem is there's just so much technology, right? How do we sort through all the noise? How do we know what we're dealing with? How do we use it the right way? So this slide here is just kind of illustrating what is out there, what is coming. We got three different indices, if you will, that kind of help us assess technologies and what's coming. In the upper left, with all the colorful red and yellow pictures, this comes from the World Economic Forum. Every year they put out a list of what they consider the top 10 emerging technologies, and these are the top 10 for 2016. Some of the ones represented are two-dimensional materials, which would be things like graphene. We've got artificial intelligence, we have autonomous vehicles. So a lot of things that we're already seeing, and a lot of things that we still have to consider how we're going to incorporate that into our worker health and safety protocols, how we're going to evaluate these technologies. On the bottom left, this comes from a digital services company called Atos. This is something called the Tech Radar, and this is kind of their way of trying to understand what they consider the top technologies for the next 3 years, and how that they classify these into a low, medium, and a transformational, impact in terms of business aspects. The upper right is kind of what I call the Big Magilla, right? So this comes from a company called Gartner. They're a marketing services company. This is something called the hype cycle. So this gives you a view of all of the technologies that they consider to have an impact over the next 10 years. So all of this to say that there's a slew of things that are already here. There's a slew of things that are still coming. To kind of put this into perspective, I thought this was really interesting. So here's a couple of numbers. This is from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So in 2015, there were 298,000 utility patents granted. From 1790 to 1883, there was almost the same number of utility patents granted. So in the first 93 years of the Patent and Trademark Office, we had the same number of patents that we did in 2015 alone. So if you don't think that technology is rapidly accelerating, I hope that this kind of changes your mind. So just as an illustration of technologies, we talked about some this morning, and I don't know if this was planned, but they actually fit into 3 nice little buckets. I didn't get a chance to know what all of these are going to be about, so I guessed, but I think I got pretty close. So we heard Jim talk about how they're using drones to do the stack inspection. So I think that goes into the bucket of how can we use technology to, replace a person or to get that person out of the way, right? Remove that person from the activity. The second bucket, Scott talked about the work that he's done with the engineering nanomaterials, looking at health and safety risk. I think that goes into the bucket of how do we understand these emerging risks? How do we make these technologies as safe as possible? Then the third bucket goes to Brian's point, talking about how do we protect people from machines? What sorts of technologies can we use to make machines safer, to make people more aware of their surroundings? So I wanted to kind of build on that a little bit and talk about what I consider the 5 big technologies that I think are going to have the greatest impact. Coming from a Department of Defense perspective, artificial intelligence is kind of the center point of DoD's third offset strategy. So this is kind of their paradigm of how they're going to conduct operations in the future. They're building this thing that they call the human-machine interface, right? How do you have a person's function that can be augmented by technology? And a lot of this has to do with machine learning, right? How do we make machines think, make them smarter? We face this every day. If anybody has a smartphone, if you have Siri or Cortana or Alexa, something like that, every time you say something, it learns your patterns, it learns your thoughts. Smart thermostats, kind of the same way, things like Nest, right? They understand our activities, and so they learn and they get smarter, and they basically know what we want, which is very strange. But anyway, so a lot of this is being incorporated into the workplaces, and we'll talk a little bit about the challenges on the next slide. Virtual reality, augmented reality, right? So how do we create basically a digital representation of our world? Pacific Gas and Electric is actually using this to improve some of their efficiency with inspections. So they've actually taken one of their substations, they created a virtual world. Somebody can put on a set of goggles and they can virtually inspect that substation without actually being there. So you actually remove a person from that dangerous environment. 3D printing, I think hopefully all of us are familiar with that. And we can 3D print anything from a little trinket to a car, right? We just saw, I think a couple years ago here locally, we were able to 3D print a car. Department of Energy sponsored that. A lot of amazing things happening with that. There's some challenges, obviously. If you're 3D printing things, you're taking a lot of production out of that. We don't need these huge factories anymore. We don't need a lot of people, so there are some challenges there. There's also things that we have to consider with emissions from these machines, but they're available. You can go to Staples, I think, and buy a desktop printer for about $300. So it's really changing the game in terms of production and capacity. The Internet of Things, right? This network of sensors that are embedded in all these products and how they communicate with each other. Brian touched a little bit on that with the technology. He talked about how we can kind of locate people and track them and see where they're at and give them some early warning system. And then also, finally, advanced materials. I would consider nanomaterials, part of that advanced material category. But some of the improvements that we made, if you look at things like steel and concrete, right? Those have been an amazing invention in terms of how we have constructed materials and buildings and how much better they've gotten. But a lot of things, you look at plastics, you look at next generations of polymers. Somebody earlier had mentioned things with like antimicrobial and anti-chemical resistant clothing, right? So a lot of things that are being incorporated that are really protecting us in ways that we never thought were possible. But unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and unicorns, right? So there are some things that we have to consider. We just can't take a new technology and throw it into the workplace and say, okay, that's a good job, right? So probably one of the biggest things that really affects us all is job elimination. And we see this a lot, right? Automation has replaced a lot of jobs. So we've taken people away from dangerous processes, but we've eliminated the need for that person. So there are political and economic and social issues associated with that. It's estimated that by 2025, artificial intelligence will replace about 30% of the jobs that currently exist. And by 2055, automation will replace about half of all the jobs that currently exist. So these are some big challenges that we need to think about. Yeah, we've really improved the safety if nobody's working, right? But that's a whole other issue that we have to consider. Privacy. So anything that's connected to the internet can be hacked, can be tracked. So we use sensors to track people to make them safer, but it also opens up some privacy issues because now we know where everybody is, right? We know if somebody's going to get hit by a train, we can pull them away, but we also know when they go to the bathroom, we know what they're eating for dinner, right? So things we have to consider there. Finally, there's always unintended consequences. Michelle, I mentioned earlier about the tech neck, right? Everybody's using iPhones and iPads and things like that, but now we have different musculoskeletal issues that we never thought about before. My generation, we're really big on texting, right? So we have a lot of thumb problems, things that you haven't really thought about before. So just to kind of wrap this all up, there's a lot of different ways that you can evaluate a technology, but just because something exists doesn't mean that you should just put it into your workspace, right? So there's some considerations that we have to keep in mind. The top one, the risk and safety, this one is kind of a thin line here. Just because something is on the market doesn't necessarily mean it's been vetted and has all these regulatory things behind it. So you have to really make sure that it's the best fit for your organization. Effectiveness, obviously we want something to work. We want it to work well. So we want to evaluate whether or not it's going to do what we hope it does. A couple other things, price, budget impact, how much is something going to cost? Just because something's a great technology doesn't mean that it's cost effective, doesn't mean that it's right for your needs. Return to daily activities, right? If you take something like a drone or a sensor, if you implement that, how quickly can your workers get back to work, right? You don't want to implement something that's going to take months to get into practice, and then you're losing a lot of work time. So you have to keep those things in mind. And then finally, the immediacy. Once you implement something, how fast do you get people back to work? How much of an impact does that technology make? So just some things to keep in mind. And I will leave you with this. NIOSH has, I think, a pretty good manual. It's called Emerging Technologies and the Safety and Health of Working People. It was published in 2006, but it kind of gives a nice overview of how you evaluate technologies and how you can incorporate those into your workspace. It's becoming a little dated. It's been 11 years, and the pace of technology is kind of moving too far ahead, but I think it's still a good guide, and hopefully they'll consider revising that sometime. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for staying. I tried to keep it short. I know everybody's been sitting here for a long time. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, call me. I'll be hanging around here for a little bit. So thank you.